Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation of Managing Historical Allegations of Abuse, presented by Praesidium. With us today is Adriana Dominguez. On behalf of Praesidium, I'd like to thank her and hand the floor over to her. Thank you, Adriana.
Thank you, Gerald. Hi, everyone. First of all, let me thank you all for joining us and for your interest in this particular topic. We will be talking about this topic for about 40-45 minutes at most, and then we will open up the floor for a few questions. I presume most of you are familiar with Praesidium, but Praesidium, as you may know, is an organization that has been working in this area of child protection, abuse prevention, safe environments for close to 30 years now, and so we partner with different youth-serving organizations, and we try to provide support in order to create these safe environments and put into place structures and policies not only to prevent it, but in the unfortunate event that something does happen, how to respond to that. And so, like we said, today we are going to be talking about historical allegations. Like Gerald said, my name is Adriana Dominguez. I work primarily with the religious services team here at Praesidium, also work with our Latin American clients, and supporting in our investigations department, so I have some experience with this. So, as we may know, historical allegations, we're going to be treating them a little bit different from anything that is currently involving a minor. So historical allegations, what we refer to as historical allegations, are allegations that took place a long time ago. So it's not something that is currently happening or abuse that is currently taking place, but it's abuse that happened maybe a few years ago, many years ago. And so most of the historical allegations that we see, that really high peak that we end up seeing, is typically from the 50s, 60s, 70s. At least in the information that we have gathered up until now. And so we're going to be talking about how can we manage these, keeping in mind that maybe there is no criminal process that is going to be undertaken by the authorities because it has been a really long time, and so there's nothing that they can do. But that doesn't mean there isn't anything that the organization itself can do to address these type of situations. And so this past year, in 2018, if we've been paying attention to the news, you may have noticed that we saw an unprecedented increase in public awareness of organizational abuse. We have seen several high-profile cases and investigations that have helped shed additional light on the overall understanding and scope and dynamics of sexual abuse. And so we will be talking about some of those high-profile cases that may ring a bell. And so, although most of those situations have to do with historical cases and their historical nature, something that's very important to know is that their impact is shaping how organizations move forward now. So, although they happened many years ago, and as unfortunate as they may be, managing these and addressing these can help us better how we move forward and how we address this risk within our organizations. So just going through some of these high-profile types of cases or organizations that we saw involved during the 2018 year, we see on here the Me Too movement. Many of you will remember that. And although it focused primarily on adult women and their experiences in the workplace, we know that this went viral, that it spread into Hollywood and other areas, into politics. And so why do we mention this? It doesn't have to do with kids, but it does have to do with abuse. And many of the lessons that we have learned as a result of this Me Too movement, many of those lessons translate into the work with other vulnerable populations and kids. Many of you may recall as well the Pennsylvania report, and this has to do in particular with the Catholic Church. So some of you may be familiar, in 2002, if you watched the movie Spotlight and the Boston Globe, the scandal that broke in 2002 related to clergy abuse. And so years later, now in 2018, one of the dioceses, there was a grand jury investigation in one of the dioceses in Pennsylvania, and there was an additional report that was presented as a result of that. And so some of the lessons that we learned there as well, we know that this continues to happen. We know that more and more society is paying attention to these types of trends. Even though things happened many, many years ago, it still has an impact today. As a result of that grand jury report, what we have seen is we've seen at least 12 other states follow suit in opening investigations into dioceses and cases of clergy abuse. Something else that you may have noticed that we saw in the news in 2018 that was talked about a lot was the Nassar case, and he was a doctor that was sentenced to 175 years in jail for abusing of several athletes, and he was particularly involved with the USA Gymnastics Organization and Michigan State University. And so again, although these are cases that happened a long time ago, we know that the organization has been very impacted and affected by that. And we've also seen, as a result of that, certain legislation come about as a result of everything that's happened, and any type of youth sports being scrutinized a little bit more, and there being more demanding as far as some preventive measures that they are trying to see or wanting to see from these organizations. And then another trend that we also saw in 2018 was a lot more publicity around cases involving elite private schools, primarily these, a lot of them being boarding schools, and so how this has also changed the mentality within that industry insofar as paying a little bit more attention to this and wanting to do a little bit more in this regard. So just a little bit of some of the historical allegations that we have seen in 2018, and some of the cases that have helped us learn additional lessons in this area. One of the questions that often comes up when we talk about historical allegations is, why do people wait so long? And so one of the important things to keep in mind here when we're responding or addressing the historical allegation is to keep in mind that a delayed disclosure doesn't diminish the credibility of the person. We know, and these past situations in 2018, they have further emphasized why disclosures are often delayed. We know, based on research, that about 80% of abuse is not reported, and a lot of the times the reason that is given by victims or survivors is a lack of trust in the system. And so just many of us have seen this information, but what you see up here in the presentation, these are just some of the reasons why people may not come forward immediately. Particularly being a kid, it is very difficult for a kid to have to face this. In many cases, they really don't understand what is happening. This is normal to them. They feel shame, they blame themselves, or they fear that they're going to be hurt, or they fear retaliation, or if it's a third party that's not coming forward, they're afraid to say something because they're afraid that something is going to happen to them for being the whistleblower, if that's what you want to call it. And so overall, we know that there's a lot of trauma, emotional and psychological, that happens when someone is abused, and so all of that plays a role in people not wanting to come forward. Keeping in mind also that maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, we didn't have the knowledge, and there wasn't this kind of push for people to be able to talk about this openly without being shamed for it. So some of the things that we have seen after analyzing some of these historical allegations, we're going to talk a little bit about these. And it's something that we see very often in any type of case of abuse. So we know that there are power differentials. We know that typically the aggressor is someone who takes advantage of the power or the position of authority that they have, and so that in itself creates this power differential, in these circumstances. And so that's inherently nature of it. I know many of you are in this church setting, and so part of what we say is in any type of pastor relationship, congregant relationship, there's going to be that inherent power differential, just as there is, for example, in schools between a teacher and a student. And so that there's always that power differential that's going to exist when we have a type of abuse case happening. Something else that we often see is community grooming. What does community grooming mean? Or what do we mean by when we say community grooming? So community grooming talks about this process where the perpetrator kind of gains the trust of the whole community. These are people that are very well esteemed. They're always happy to help. They lend a helping hand. And many of the time we see what we call this 90-10 dynamic. And so 90% of the time these people are great. They're helpful. They're good people. They're doing great things. And then 10% of the time is when maybe they exhibit some of this behavior that is not so great, this behavior that may raise some red flags. And so when a community is groomed, essentially what happens is this person creates a picture where no one in the community can think that they can do anything wrong. And so they are highly esteemed. They're kind of put on a pedestal. They're considered a role model. And so what this creates as well is when people want to come forward and want to say something, it makes it even more difficult because this person or perpetrator appears to be perfect in the eyes of everyone else. And so it's that much more difficult that people are going to believe that this person did something wrong. Again, like I said, a lot of these people, they're very well esteemed, respected people. We've seen in many articles, Teacher of the Year, and they got an award, a teacher that won an award from Oprah or something like that. And so all that to say, people that are going to abuse, sometimes what we want these people to be bad all the time, but unfortunately that's not the case. It can be just like anybody. They can be people that are very well liked in the community. We also know that trusted institutions are a big target. Institutions that have a very good reputation. And why? Because then they take advantage of this reputation to say, well, no one from that institution would dare do something wrong. And so, again, we see this trusted institutions like these highly regarded schools or the church itself. And the other thing to note about any type of church, whether that be Christian or Catholic or whatever it may be, we know that the institution itself is a trusting institution historically. It's an institution where we want to serve, we want to help people, we want to welcome everybody, and so that makes us a little bit more vulnerable as well, because that's the mindset of churches and religion. We want to welcome everybody, and we want to try to help everybody, and that also makes us vulnerable a little bit because people are going to target those institutions because they know trust is inherent in that institution. Another thing that we see in themes of historical allegations are these last two, is where we typically have a large number of victims and we typically have multiple offenders. And what does this tell us about the organization? Really, when we have this, there's often multiple offenders, there's often a large number of victims, this points to a period of time within which the organization's maybe culture and leadership wasn't the best or wasn't the strongest. Maybe during that period of time, leadership was a little bit permissive or there was a lack of leadership. And keeping in mind, this was we're talking about historical allegations. So many years ago also, people didn't know what we now know about how this happens within an organization. And so that's typically often when we see it, when we see these historical allegations in large numbers, is there was a breakdown in the organization, whether that was leadership or culture. And so it lent itself or opened itself up for this risk, or to this risk. So some of the types of historical allegations that we see, so typically it's an adult victim that's reporting abuse by a past employee or a program participant. And so I want to take advantage of this, when we talk about program participant and when we talk about historical allegations, we're not only referring to cases of abuse from an adult to a child, but also from youth to youth. What we know now after many years is that it is just as likely that we may have a peer-to-peer abuse case and maybe an adult to youth case. So important to keep that in mind. One question that often comes up when we are dealing with allegations against a past employee or a program participant for you to keep in mind is, one of the questions that comes up is, do you know where this person is now? So they're not within your institutional organization, but do you know where they are now? And then the other question to ask is, if we do know where they are they in a position where they still have access to children? And why is that important? That is important to keep in mind because depending on where this person is and what they're doing, if they're still working with minors, depending on the state, you will want to check in of whether you have a responsibility to report this based on that. So we want to make sure that we are checking in with our attorneys. If we do know where they are and we do know that they're still working with kids, we want to check in with them and get some advice around some state requirements. The second type of historical allegations are these, we have an adult victim that's reporting abuse by a current employee. And so, of course, one of the important first steps to take here is if they are a current employee or volunteer and we know that they're still working with our kids, making sure that we remove them from that position while the outcome is pending. And just so we're making sure that they're safe, that the kids are safe, and that, we are protecting the organization as well. So, of course, it's going to be an important step. And then the last part is where either an adult, whether it's a victim or a third party, reports multiple allegations. And typically how we have seen this play out is a victim or a third party that has been affected by this. And particularly, again, we talked about when this happens and there's a large number of victims and offenders, it's because there was something wrong with culture or leadership. And so in this case, we have a single person reporting multiple offenders or multiple instances of abuse. Part of the question is, why do we need to respond to historical allegations, particularly if we know that in many cases a lot of years have passed and there is no mandated reporting obligation anymore, or we know that nothing is going to be able to be done by the authorities, at least in some type of criminal regard. And while that is true, well, perhaps there will not be able to be some type of criminal case or the person won't be able to be sent to jail or anything like that. There are other reasons why us as an organization, independent of what the authorities decide to do, want to address these types of cases. Probably, of course, the most important is because we want to make sure that we give the victim or the survivor the adequate pastoral response and showing the adequate compassion to them so that they don't feel ignored. But as you can see up here, some of the other reasons of why we want to make sure that we respond to these historical allegations is it can help us identify possible additional victims. So again, if it was this time period where either the culture or leadership or something just lent itself for this risk, within the organization. It can help us identify other people that may have gone through something similar, and it can allow us to help them heal in this process. It can also help us provide support services to the victims. What that looks like a lot of times is maybe counseling, at the very least, trying to help find some counseling for them. Of course, we also have to think about the reputation of the organization. And so the response that we have is going to really affect the perspective and how the public is going to see us. If you can recall, and I use the Catholic Church as an example because they have been a big one that has been out there and that has been incredibly impacted by this as well, is when a lot of these scandals are breaking out, people are upset at the abuse that has happened, but sometimes those feelings of anger and resentment, and they're just worsened by the type of response that the organization has had, whether that's a response of ignoring people, the response of passing the perpetrators from one location to the other. And so how we respond to these allegations is going to play out in how the people see us, whether people are going to continue to trust our organization, and quite frankly, in many times, whether they're going to continue to support us, support the organization's mission. So that's just another reason. We want to ensure that there's no additional looming incidents. So use the opportunity to address anything else that might be out there. Use it as an opportunity to make sure that we're going to tighten all the screws within our prevention efforts, and making sure that we're addressing everything. So not responding to this single allegation in isolation and saying we took care of this, it's saying how can this help us improve our overall safe environment and our efforts in this area. Of course, important, we want to identify whether there are any reporting obligations to the authorities. And then last of all, it's easier to defend the known versus the unknown. So maybe many, many years ago, it was okay for us to say, well, we didn't know, we didn't have the tools. But nowadays, that's really not going to be enough. And it's going to be easier for you as an organization to answer questions and to speak to this if you know what happened. And so it's better to be informed, to try to figure out what happened, and take ownership and take ownership of that response. And by doing this, you're also showing that you're taking this seriously and how important it is for you to learn about this and to improve and become better for the protection of everyone that's involved within your organization. So what are some of our goals? Of course, we want to determine, did this occur? Is the allegation, is what the person presenting to us, did it happen? If it's someone that is working currently with us, it's going to help us determine what is going to happen with this person. Once everything is said and done, once an investigation happens, and depending on the allegation, of course, what are we going to do with this particular employee, or how does this impact other employees, and maybe what we will require from them in the future. Of course, we talked about this. We want to try to identify and assist possible victims and help them in that healing process. And then, like we've talked, use these lessons learned to inform current prevention, to inform any changes that need to happen. Now, we know that because these are historical allegations and they happened a long time, that in and of itself presents some challenges in being able to respond to them. And so these are just some of the general challenges that we have seen in some of the cases that we have personally had to deal with. And so there's an unwillingness to want to dig into the past. Particularly if during those times it wasn't a very positive experience for anyone in the organization, and people they don't want to remember that, they don't want to relive that, and so people just don't want to go back there. They don't want to go 40, 50 years and talk about unpleasant experiences. And so that's going to play into people wanting to come forward and feeling comfortable with giving you information or being interviewed as part of the fact-gathering process as you look into the allegations. The perceived difficulty of investigation, and what do we talk about here? Again, we know that these allegations may have happened a really long time ago, and so we know, people may have been deceased, or maybe they're already deceased, since it was such a long time ago. Maybe there wasn't adequate record keeping back then, or records have been lost or destroyed. We've had cases where organizations have changed leadership or managing companies 3-4 times, and so records have been lost. Or maybe they have been, they've had some type of fire or something. We've had this happen too, and all of that documentation was lost, or maybe, maybe information wasn't passed along, and so it's difficult to try to find that information 40, 50, 30 years ago, later, and so. And then last of all, reporting requirements will differ from a recent allegation. So we've talked about this a little bit. We know that if we find out or hear about a current case of abuse, meaning that the victim is currently a minor, we know in many states we automatically have to report that to the authorities. But it's not as clear when it has to do with a historical allegation, meaning that the abuse was of a minor, but this was many, many years ago, and the victim is now an adult. Although we will say the best practice is always to report and to notify the authorities about any type of allegation that you received. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is they're going to tell you, thank you for letting us know. It has been a really long time. The statute of limitations, meaning the time period that the victim has to come forward, has already expired, and there's nothing we can do. And I mean, that's the worst that can happen, but at least you have shown that you have taken the precaution of notifying the authorities, becoming informed of whether you need or they need to pursue this further. And then you can also have the opportunity to document this if you should need it in the future for any reason. So generally speaking, when we talk about responding to a historical allegation, so it's important to know and determine who do we need to notify, both internally and externally, other than the authorities, who are stakeholders that need to know about this. And so it's important, if possible, to think about this ahead of time and just say, if this were to ever happen, who are the people that we need to immediately contact? And so having that already ready makes it that much easier, just because we know that when a crisis like this hits us, it gets a little bit chaotic, so it's sometimes easy to miss important things. 2, we want to determine the scope of the investigation, and the scope is going to be informed by the type of allegation and the details of the allegation. So are we going to focus on a particular time period? So, for example, if the allegation is against a couple of perpetrators, trying to figure out what years were they here. Are we going to limit it to those years? Are we limiting it to specific individuals? So, is it one person that's being accused, 2, 3? What's our focus going to be? Who are we going to reach out to? Are we going to want to reach out to past program participants, or maybe just people that participated or were with us during a certain time period? And what are we trying to find out? That's important as well. What are we trying to accomplish by looking into this allegation? And to help you determine that scope, you want to develop these critical investigation questions again. And what we mean by this is the questions that will help you answer the what, when, where, who, who was there, what happened, when did this happen. And then thinking about what can we reasonably do to answer these questions. So what actions can we take to answer these questions? Does that mean having an investigation, which we definitely recommend, but what is that going to entail? Does that mean that we're going to try to look for people maybe that were in the organization during those years, trying to look for witnesses? And are we going to try to schedule interviews? Is there documentation that we can review? What type of files maybe can we look into or look at to try to gather some information about how things happened or what happened, so many years ago? And this question becomes also particularly important if it is the case, that some of those witnesses or people involved are already deceased, and so we know we can no longer have the advantage of having their input. We want to conduct that investigation, whether that's internal, external, and we'll talk a little bit more about, looking at help from external professionals in doing that and why that is preferred. But again, just conducting that investigation, figuring out what that's going to entail. What type of questions are we going to be asking our witnesses? And if you're using external help and professional help, they can definitely help you craft these types of questions. And those are just an extension of those critical investigation questions. And one of the suggestions that we make here is when you're crafting these questions is make them open-ended questions. Give the person that you're interviewing the opportunity to talk about it and to describe it. And so try to stay away from yes or no questions initially. You might have to get to those at the very end, but initially things like, tell me about your time at so-and-so organization. Tell me about your responsibilities. Tell me about the particular person in question. Describe them. How do they behave with kids? Did they have a reputation, or rather, what kind of reputation did they have? So just keeping them very broad, and then as you get more information, of course, then you might have to hone into those yes or no questions. And then once you conclude that investigation, what else do you need to do other than this investigation? Do you need to open up additional resources, maybe for families, for victims? Do we, maybe as a result of the investigation, do we need to open up a broader investigation, or are there additional instances or allegations that we found out about that we need to look into? And then last of all, of course, provide resources, not only to the victims, but, thinking about resources for our own people, meaning the people that are still within our organizations, and maybe the families of the participants as well. So given that that these allegations happened a long time ago, we know that it can be really hard to get clear answers, and so just some additional tips to avoid those murky findings, making sure that you have a clear scope and a clear goal in your investigation, so that things kind of don't get out of hand and then become too overwhelming and not manageable. Again, the importance of considering hiring investigation professionals. And this is particularly important if we're talking about a high-profile case or allegations where we're having a lot of victims. But generally speaking, regardless of that, if the organization can afford it, it is very important, beneficial to have external people conduct your investigations. One, because you're showing that you are being transparent, and there's not going to be a question of whether there was a bias in the investigation and whether there was objectivity throughout the investigation. So keeping in mind that organizations are being scrutinized more and more in their responses, we want to avoid that perception of bias or not being objective, and so hiring external professionals is definitely going to help us avoid that. And then, of course, to the extent that it is available and that it exists, rely heavily on that documentation where possible to support any interviews, to help you craft questions, and help you kind of explore some of those details in the interviews that you have. So kind of a brief timeline of what we want to do when we receive a historical allegation. You want to activate your crisis response team, and we realize that maybe in smaller organizations it's a little bit more difficult to have a group of professionals that can help us through this. But at the very least, identify one or two people in leadership that are going to take responsibility for leading this response. Whether that's the pastor or whether that's anybody else within your organization, if at least have an idea or identify an attorney that could potentially help guide you through this so that you're not having to look for that at the last minute. Maybe you already have a list of people who might be able to help with that. Maybe public relations PR firms that can help you with the communications, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So again, you definitely want to, within the first few hours, you want to let those people know and activate your team. It doesn't hurt to have kind of a crisis response protocol as well that is going to guide you. And if that is in writing, that's very important and helpful, because then it's less likely that you're going to miss something if you follow that. We talked about this, but of course, ensure the immediate safety of everyone involved, particularly if we're talking about someone that is being accused that is still involved in your organization. So making sure that we are putting this person on leave and removing them from access to children or our vulnerable populations pending the outcome of the whole process. Again, very important, making sure that we are fulfilling with these mandated reporting requirements. And like I said, regardless of whether this happened to many years ago, our recommendation or best practice is always notify the authorities anyway. Like we said, the worst that can happen is they can tell you there's nothing we can do. Thank you, but at least you have that. And then last of all, and very, very important, making sure that you're documenting everything that's happening. The allegations that you're receiving, the details, what actions you're taking, who you're notifying, if you're doing this in writing, making sure that you're keeping all of that documentation as well to support, in case anything else comes around, you have that readily available. You can clearly show what you've been doing to respond, and it also helps you not miss any details. So. After those initial hours, in the next couple of days, definitely want to establish and maintain communication with authorities. Why is this important as well? Particularly with historical allegations, what often happens is, again, because they cannot proceed with a criminal case, the authorities may not want to do anything, but we still want to make sure that they're okay with us conducting an internal investigation. And many of the times, they will be okay with that. We ourselves have had to reach out to the authorities in the past when we're helping a client with investigations, and just letting them know, we've been hired to conduct an internal investigation of this. We just want to make sure that we have the green light and that we are not going to be interfering with anything that you will be doing. And they're pretty communicative about that, and so they'll let you know. We're okay with it, please move forward. Many times, of course, what they will say is, if you do come across anything else, if during your internal investigation you find out about any illegal activity or crime that needs to be handled by us, then please keep us aware of that. And so there'll have to be an open communication with them. And then sometimes, they'll let you know, maybe we're going to look into it, but it's okay if you do X, Y, and Z, and they'll point you in that direction or guide you of, you might not be able to do this at the time, but maybe these are some steps that we're okay with you taking at the moment. Again, determining what type of internal investigation will be done, who's going to conduct that, what scope is going to be, and having media statements ready, an initial communication plan. We'll talk a little bit more, or give you a little bit more of these communication tips in the next slide, but making sure that you have these ready, even if it is just templates that you can later tweak, that goes a long way in not having to kind of create something in the spur of the moment when things are chaotic, when things are stressful, when perhaps people's emotions are, just running really high. So making sure that we have these ready, and that so we're not caught off guard as well, so that if we are approached by the media, that we have appropriate responses and we're not just coming up with something in the spur of the moment. Again, continuing to communicate with those stakeholders or key stakeholders, whether that's your church council, your attorneys, maybe your insurance, also your church leadership. So these people that are going to support you in responding to this. And then again, the importance of, if possible, soliciting external expertise, whether that's in conducting the investigation, whether that's from a PR firm in crafting some of these communications, maybe further help with an organization that has experience in crisis response, and then definitely, of course, you want to be checking in with your attorneys in every step that you take. Some general communication tips, of course, you want to show compassion. You want to show that you're taking this seriously. Be honest. Be transparent. That goes a long way. Share what you can, and your attorneys will definitely help you in determining what it is that you can share. And follow up. Making sure that you're keeping people informed of what is happening, that you are taking steps, so that there's not this presumption that nothing is happening, that things are being ignored, and that there's just some type of inaction from the organization. So making sure that you're following up. Designate a point person to respond to inquiries, and making sure that you communicate that to your organization, to your staff, to your volunteers, making sure that everybody knows if you are approached by any reason by the media, whether that be a reporter, a blogger, a journalist, whatever the case may be, you should be referring those people very respectfully, letting them know I'm not authorized to make any comments, but you can direct your questions to, and then making sure that they have a number or an email or something that they can give, so that they can communicate with that designated point person. And this way we also prevent, from different things being said and maybe things that shouldn't be said, and so just making sure that we're clear about this. And then again, communicate steps that you're taking. Talk about what things you're already doing. Maybe you're already offering some resources. You're already offering training. Talking about we're looking into this, we're taking it seriously, we're conducting an investigation to find out what happened and to get to the bottom of this. Just again, making people aware of the fact that we are doing something about it. And then within those first initial weeks, we want to make sure that we identify the necessary resources, whether that's resources for the victims. Like I said, oftentimes that can be counseling. Maybe we can identify a few professionals that we can refer the victims to, psychologists, counselors, therapists. For our families, particularly if it's something that has become very public, what type of resources can we provide to our own families, maybe of participants? Whether that's resources about how to talk to your kids about this, or resources about, these are our policies. This is the prevention efforts that we have been implementing or developing within our organization, or giving parents tools about how to talk to their kids about this, about, if anything happens to you, if anybody tries to hurt you, who they can talk to, who they can go to. And then resources for your staff as well. We know that any type of allegation, the impact goes beyond the victim or the survivor. We know that the victim is impacted, the community is impacted, the organization as a whole is impacted. And so making sure that we also make resources available for our staff, for our volunteers, for our workers. Sometimes we know that some of these people may have been very close to either the victims or the actual perpetrator, and so they themselves might go through some trauma if they feel betrayed, or maybe, what often happens is if people were around at the time of the abuse and they didn't notice anything, then they begin to feel a sense of guilt of why didn't I notice anything, or if they didn't notice that things were off, why didn't I say anything? So just making sure that we have those resources available. Again, deploying that communication plan. Once you've identified who needs to be notified of what, making sure that we make that happen. Sometimes what we see is some organizations will choose to deploy a helpline, and maybe it's opening up, sending out a communication and saying, maybe to a particular people that participated in a particular program or in a particular year, just open-ended. If you have any concerns or if you want to share any experiences, please call this helpline, and someone will listen to you, and then kind of next steps will be taken after that. Something else that some organizations also do is they set up a website where people can go to, and they can kind of find out what is happening, meaning not the details, but we as an organization, we are providing maybe some type of professional help, of counseling. We are conducting an investigation, but also sometimes some of these tools or resources for families that I was talking about can be posted in this website. Maybe referrals to some kind of advocacy center or professionals that can work with families, or some of these resources of how can you talk to your children about these things, etc. Identify on-the-spot training. These are opportunities to refresh our memories on, what are our policies, what are our supervision protocols for, for restrooms or for camps or for field trips. They serve as a refresher. And then last of all is find the root cause. Try to figure out what went wrong. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What do we mean when we talk about the root cause analysis? So essentially, root cause analysis is when you keep asking why. And this type of analysis is used a lot in the medical field to try to figure out what happened. So, for example, they lose a patient dies in the OR, and so they ask why. And so maybe the patient bled out. Why? Why did the patient bleed out? Well, they bled out because we used the wrong clamp. Well, why did we use the wrong clamp? Well, we ran out of the right size. There wasn't any available. So why did we run out? So because, no one placed a new order for new clamps because, okay, and so why didn't that happen? The person who usually places the orders, they were out for personal reasons and no one else knew how. Well, why did no one else know how? Well, we hadn't trained anybody else. And so that's kind of how it goes. We work through it so that we identify what was the problem. Was it a lack of training? Was it a lack of policy? Was it a lack of supervision? Generally speaking, we'll walk really briefly to how do we conduct this root cause analysis, and knowing that this is probably going to overlap with, the investigation and what we find out in the investigation, but just the steps. We want to define the problem. What type of allegation are we dealing with here? Was it an adult-to-child type of abuse? Was it a peer-to-peer type of abuse? Was it a false allegation? And so trying to identify, again, the who, the what, the where, and the when. So we're going to define the problem here. And the nature of the actual allegation. Where did it happen? Who was present? At what time? In what physical space? Collect that data. Review the incident, review the allegation, review the investigation. Look at any necessary documentation, making sure that we're interviewing key individuals. If it's something that happened after programming or late hours, talking to the people that were supposed to be there during that time. Review your policies. Review any training curriculum as well, just to see what do we have, what have we been training people on. And again, go through this question of asking why. Why did this happen? Why was a person alone? Why was this not reporting? Kind of continuing to ask those why questions. And really what you will notice, or what you should notice, is that sometimes it's a breakdown in the system. And if you keep going, if the majority of the causes result in them being staff failures, this is very important, then there's a good chance that we're not digging deep enough. And this is important because often the idea is that there's one bad apple, and that by removing that one bad apple, we're getting rid of the problem. And most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, this bad apple was able to do something bad because there was a breakdown in the system. There was a breakdown in our screening structure or protocols. Maybe there was a breakdown in our supervision structure. Maybe there's a breakdown in our policies. So we want to make sure that we are asking the right questions and that we continue to ask why. And then let's identify that corrective action. What can we learn? Once we identify the breakdown, what can we do about it? What can we do so that we prevent this from happening again? Is it changing our policies? Is it improving our policies? Is it reevaluating a policy? Sometimes what we see is we have policies that they're not realistic, or we can't implement them, and so finding a way to make that happen, and if not, then finding a different way of managing that risk, but having to change the policy. Was it something having to do with supervision? Do we need to develop new supervision plans? Do we need to maybe reevaluate our screening process? Is there additional resources or components that we can add to make sure that we are really screening out those people that shouldn't be working within our organizations and that may present a risk? And then, of course, what resources do we need to make sure that we implement these changes and these best practices? And then something else here that we don't have is how are we going to evaluate implementation and making sure that we are actually following this? And again, the goal here is to continue to learn. So if we continue to ask, what are our weaknesses, then we continue to improve, and that's really the goal as we move forward. Last of all, this is just kind of a quick list of some of the resources that we provide. Many of you, or you will have access, you have access to some of these resources through IB that I'm sure Gerald can tell you a little bit or give you a little bit more information about. Something else at the very end here, you see a Praesidium report. Every year we evaluate information that we get of cases. So Praesidium runs a helpline where people or organizations can call, and we help them manage some type of situation that they're having, whether that's a situation having to do with boundary violations or historical allegation. And so we analyze that information, and we produce a report based on that. And so if you're interested in just learning a little bit more, keeping abreast of what is happening, I encourage you to look at that Praesidium report. Or if you're interested in learning about what other resources are available to you through IB, I'm sure Gerald can help you with that. Other than that, I again want to thank you for your assistance. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now. Gerald, I don't know if you have anything to add yourself.
No. Thank you again. For anyone looking to ask a question, please feel free to type it into the attendee chat box while we wait for questions. For anyone looking for background checking services or training services, please reach out to loss control at insuranceboard.org, and we can help you get set up. The trainings are free of charge, and the background checks are discounted for all members of the denominations we serve and further subsidized for anyone who purchases their insurance through the insurance board. So that is a great benefit to all and an even better benefit to our policyholders. So having said that, I will give a couple minutes here for questions to appear. I think we're towards the end of our hour here, but certainly I can make time for questions. Hopefully you can as well for a couple minutes anyway.
Definitely, Gerald. Definitely.
Well, I'm not seeing much activity there, so I'm going to end it here. Thank you again. And for anyone who has questions after the fact, or if you're just viewing this through our portal, please feel free to reach out to loss control at insuranceboard.org with any questions you may have. We'll be happy to help you however we can. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gerald.